This is Religion and Theology, a podcast from the Center for Theology and Religious Studies. This is the third lecture out of 7 in the series The Many Guises of European Catholicism, hosted by CTR, as well as the Center for European Studies at Lund University. The lecture goes under the title Theology of the Nation, the role of the Catholic Church in Poland in shaping and preserving Polish national identity, presented by Magdalena Dziaczkowska, PhD student at CTR.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm a bit distracted by this huge screen in front of me, so I don't know yet how to deal with this, but hopefully it's not going to interrupt me. First of all, I would like to say a few words on my approach to this topic and why I chose to speak about this particular theme. My research is dealing with, as Stefan said, Jewish-Christian relations in Poland, and one of my main problems at this stage of my research, so very early stage, is that it's very hard to understand who is a Pole and what does Polish national identity encompass or entail, especially if compared to different minorities that were in Poland in the interwar time. Therefore, this is a kind of side excursion starting from my original research, my PhD project, but my approach is historical. My background is in history of art and in Jewish studies. But I've always used historical approach. So even though the title is Theology of the Nation, what I would really like us to do this evening is to together have this brief excursion, basically running through Polish history, because I think the answers to Polish identity as understood by Poles, lay in there. I think without understanding Polish historical circumstances and experiences, it's impossible to understand Polish national identity. Therefore, it's going to be very historical. Then, if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask me. Also, I don't mind being interrupted, so if you want to ask something while I'm talking, just raise your hand. That's perfectly fine. First of all, I was reading recently a lot about the notion of Polish national identity, or Polishness, Polskość, as we would say in Polish. And there are some core elements that majority of the researchers would agree on, that they are components of Polish national identity. That would be, of course, symbols, values, stereotypes, ideas presented or contained in literature, language, art, customs, therefore in culture. And now how did the Polish nation, or the Poles, how did we construct our national identity? In order to understand that, as I said, we need to go to our history, because I would say that maybe even more than our neighboring countries, we are very dependent on that. And I would like to start from introducing this notion of entangled identity, which also is a subtitle of this book by Krzysztof Koseła, published in 2003. He discusses core elements of Polish national identity, but also, as maybe you can understand that even though it's in Polish, Polak Catholic, Pole and Catholic. These are two criteria or to features that go very closely together. Therefore, Kosewa used this term entangled identity, which would mean that, and it's really present in stereotypes that Poles have about themselves, but also, I'd guess, in other people have on Poles, that a true Pole is also Catholic. We have the stereotype of Polish Catholic, which becomes, in the end, an amalgam, something that cannot be separated any longer. And Kosewa argues that Polish national identity, which is also Catholic identity, these two characteristics cannot be separated, and they were built using 5 core elements, which are listed here. So we would have the remnants of the Sarmatian traditions. That is the traditions that are based on what nobility, Polish nobility, thought about themselves, especially from 16th to 18th century. And this is very closely connected to knightly ethos, to the ideals of freedom, independence, honor. Then on top of this, we have religious and cultural tolerance and the tradition of multiculturalism that, however, in reality was present only, I would say, for a relatively brief time. And then it's somehow dissolved, but it's still present in our stereotypes of Poland and Poles. So we would think about ourselves that, yes, maybe I don't know, we hear from the Americans or the Western people, so to speak, the Western world. What often reappears is the accusation of anti-Semitism, for example, that Poles are, this is a stereotype, Pole an anti-Semite. But then a Polish person would say, yes, but we have this long tradition of religious freedom and tolerance, which would, in Polish mind, solve the question. Of course, all these things are very stereotypical. I'm not going in depth in my analysis right now. This is just to highlight certain points. And apart from this, we have romantic ethos that was, and by that I mean ethos that was constructed during the era of Romanticism, 19th century. And I'm going to talk about this more later. Then a pursuit of freedom, freedom being one of the core values of Polishness, or Polish national identity. And then we have Roman Catholic traditions and the conviction that usually, yes, we use this Latin name, Polonia antemurale Christianitatis, which means that Poland is this bank that protects Europe from the way of be it heretic or pagan or communist barbarism. And it's very present. And now this is very brief history of Poland. So we're gonna discuss just some points that I think are important, but as far as I know, majority of researchers would agree to, at least to a large extent, with my choices. So I think it's a good choice. What is important to know is that Poland as a state was born while it was Christianized. So we do not have any real history that is pagan. We call it prehistory. And it's, I think, very important for the formation of Polish national identity. Then very important event is union with Lithuania, you see 1401, because Lithuania was the only remaining pagan country, and they converted. They were Christianized because they entered into this union with Poland. So it's another claim to fame in Christian Europe for Poland. Then we're going to skip Slavic slave trades. I would like to stop only briefly in the red period around 1655 and generally 17th century, because it's a time where this notion of Polonia and Temporale Christianitatis is very well solidified because we have a lot of wars with, for example, Tartars, Turkey, but also our Protestant neighbors, for example, Sweden. And then we have partitions, which are also very important for preserving Polish national identity, and it's also the beginning of, I would say it's a time when modern nationalism is born. Therefore, how Poles see themselves also changes very much. And then I'm going to briefly touch upon the Second World War and post-war period, namely communism, but it's going to be very, very brief. So I intend just to give you a certain panoramic view. Yes, and almost all the pictures that I use are paintings by Jan Matejko, and I picked them on purpose because he specialized in painting historical scenes connected to the history of Poland in 19th century, and these paintings shaped, I would say, imagination of, like patriotic imagination of many generations of Poles, including me. As we said, in the middle of the 10th century, Poland started to be Christianized. Polish, well, not really Polish, Prince of Poland, Mieszko I, received baptism from the Vatican. So therefore, Poland became part of the Western world. I really like what Norman Davies said, that it's not that Poland adopted Catholicism, it's the Catholic Church that adopted Poland. But at the same time, Europe adopted Poland as its part. So we enter history as a state only through baptism and through Christianization, done in a Western way, so Roman Catholic way. Yes, I have a lot of quotation from Norman Davies because I'm a big fan of his books, those on Poland. And I think he's really to the point. What he says about the House of Piast, the first dynasty, they emerged from the mists of prehistory, but only thanks to the fact that they received Catholicism. If they didn't, they would remain these local little princes or almost chiefs of tribes. Nothing would happen on such a big scale. And then what I already said, that the beginning of Polish statehood is inextricably connected to Christianization. So since the beginning, Poland is a Christian country. And also, it's interesting because first Polish king, son of the one who received the Roman Catholicism, who was baptized, Bolesław the Brave, Bolesław Chrobry, as we would say in Polish, he received his crown from the Vatican. So since the beginning, there was this aspiration to be a part of the Western culture of Europe. And also, as in many other places, church became first, in reality, first administrative system that would cover the state in its entirety. But then I skipped the rest of the medieval times and, to be honest, also the Renaissance, although that was a period of religious tolerance. Just 2 points that I wanted to make here are that Poland became a refuge for many Protestant communities, groups, and sects, precisely because of the tolerance. There were no laws against freedom of religion or speech or conscience. And even one of the kings, King Sigismund Augustus, said, "I'm not a king of your consciences," meaning that he didn't want to get involved into the matters of religion, freedom of speech, conscience, and so on. Therefore, Poland became a flourishing center of many Protestant communities, and it's also connected very much to the development of printing and a lot of, for example, Polish Bible was, as far as I'm informed, it was printed thanks to the Protestant groups, and yes, so that would be the Renaissance. But then, I think that what happened during the Renaissance was important, and it's present in Polish national, I would say, narrative about Polish identity. But I would say that these traditions are treated in a more shallow way, while what really mattered, I think, happened afterwards. For example, we have Counter-Reformation, which was an important time for the formation of Polish national identity, for many reasons. First of all, that was a time when political situation of Poland deteriorated. We experienced many wars. So there were some external conditions that prompted Poles to be less tolerant. Then, as an answer to Reformation, there were also Jesuits who were brought to Poland in the 16th century. And interestingly, they, I would say, they monopolized Polish education for 2 centuries. I would say majority of Polish nobility in 17th and 18th century, they went to Jesuit schools, and it was a very important factor because they listened to this narrative that was presented by the Jesuits, very counter-Reformation narrative, focused on certain conservative values, being faithful to the Catholic Church, to the Vatican, and so on. Then also Jesuits managed to limit the access to certain European or Western books, and therefore they managed to limit the European influences on Polish education for quite a long time, because they were dissolved in the Polish lands by, I think that was Katarina the Great in 1773. But nonetheless, for 2 centuries, they were very, very active in the field of education. So their influence was very significant. Also, there was, I would say, quite strong censorship on books. But at the same, so that wasn't welcome after the era of religious tolerance. But what happened is that many of Polish noblemen who during the era of the Reformation they would become Protestants, they converted back to Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. So almost all noble families in Poland and Lithuania, which was one commonwealth, they became Catholic. And at the same time, some members of clergy became distinguished statesmen, like here, the person that you can see is Piotr Skarga, who was very well known for his sermons, and he was an advisor to Polish king. And he's just one of the examples of members of clergy who became very, very affluent and had an impact on Polish politics. So you can see that the Catholic interests became very close to the political ones. And what is interesting is that church was excluded from secular jurisdiction, but at the same time it maintained very, very high influence on what was going on in politics.
I think two things that might be worth saying
Yes.
is that first, even during the age of religious toleration, there were bishops like Bishop Hosiusz,
Yes, of course.
who were very strongly against Protestants. And at the same time, but I think then the polemics were the main
Yes.
tool for fighting each other. But after such a certain period of time, it was just that the scales were moved towards the Catholics because they started to employ the state apparatus to help their polemical skills.
Yes, it's true. I agree. Unfortunately, I don't feel I have enough time to go into all the details, so everything that I'm saying is just a simplification, obviously, as I intend to give you a certain overview. But
And
thank you.
the other thing I think which Piotr Skarga reminds me of is that the strange thing about Polish Catholicism was that it was the clergy that brought enlightenment to Poland and not rationalists.
Yes. Well, they were rationalists.
Yeah, yes.
But we're gonna get there. Before that, I would like to go back to this idea of Polonia ante morale Christianitatis, because this is precisely the time of Counter-Reformation. I think these two phenomena are very closely interrelated. Because this is a time when Polish nobility, which was the, I would say, the driving force of the nation, they were around 20% of the society, so quite a lot if you compare to other European countries. But back then, peasants or serfs, they wouldn't have a sense of any national belonging. Therefore, when I'm talking about 15th, 16th, 17th century, even 18th century, in these areas, I'm mostly referring to the nobility, so szlachta in Polish. So that's a time when Poland experienced a lot of wars with non-Catholics and even non-Christians. So on the one hand, you would have Turkey on the east, Tartars also on the east, Moscow also on the east, from the north you would have Sweden, so Protestant country, and these invasions that all happened in the 17th century, around the middle of the 17th century, they strengthened very much this notion that Poland as a Catholic country needs to protect Europe, needs to stand for Catholic values, needs to protect Roman Catholicism. And that was, on the one hand, very encouraged by the Vatican. On the other hand, it was also in line with certain agenda of the nobility, because that was a way of showing that you're a real knight. You can gain your honor, and you can also gain your fortune while fighting the others. And one of the, I hope it's there, yes, one of the very important events for Poland in that period was the Battle of Vienna. And it's very important in how Poles think about history, because it wasn't a Polish battle. Poland was just one of the forces engaged, but how Poles remember this is that it's a Polish victory, Catholic victory, over the Turkish power. So basically what Charlemagne did in France a couple of centuries earlier, protecting Europe from Islamic flood, we did there. So I would say that's one of very important, and this conviction is very important element in Polish understanding of who we are as a nation. Also, during that period, Polish king became so desperate about all the wars on almost all possible borders that I'm going to go back to this. That he decided to take an oath, so-called the Lwów Oath, in 1656, and to proclaim Virgin Mary Queen of Poland, which is, I would say, quite a bold step. And also he promised many things to her, which then never happened. But at the same time, it also shows that in these times of struggle, Poles tended to be more Catholic and to look for refuge, maybe not so much in the church, but in faith and connection to, for example, Virgin Mary. This is an image that this is an image of Our Lady of Częstochowa, the most famous, most important one in Poland. And also she was very, this image was very connected to one of the invasions, the Swedish one that was called the Flood in Polish. Because the legend has it that when the Swedish troops attacked, they kept these two marks on her face. So this still remains there till now. They are visible till now. And the legend has it also that she appeared herself around this monastery to protect the monastery from the Protestant heretics. So this obviously strengthens even more this idea that, Polish army, Polish people are fighting the right cause. And the right cause is to defend your country, but also to defend Catholicism. And just brief digression, the same idea was then reused in the 20th century. This is one of the few images, not by Matejko. This is the Battle of Warsaw in 1920, when in a very unexpected way, Poles won over the Soviet army. And therefore it was considered again to be a victory that prevented Europe from the Soviet flood. So again, it's the same pattern. And Poles again think of themselves in the same way. as those who somehow protect Europe. And yes, maybe the only remaining fort of Catholicism or faithfulness to the Vatican. Now I'm gonna briefly talk about partitions, and there is not so much time left. What is important is that when at the end of the 18th century Poland was divided between Russia, Prussia, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is that all Polish institutions, or almost all Polish institutions, ceased to exist. Therefore, the Church would remain the only institution still standing. At the same time, it was the only depository of Polish values, Polish culture, Polish identity. And this situation more or less remained for the entire 19th century. What is interesting, however, is that there were a lot of tensions between the Vatican and the real, I would say, the pastoral praxis of the local clergy during the 19th century, because that was a time of Polish risings for independence. There were many. I'm going to just name a few. For example, the November Rising in 1830 and then the January Rising 1863, they were officially condemned by the Vatican, which didn't influence that much the praxis of the local clergy, which, as you can see here, it's probably a Capucin friar or Bernardin friar who takes a vow from this peasant who's going to fight in a rising. So even though the Pope, I think it's Gregory XVI, would condemn this rising, what the Church in Poland really did was something completely different. But this encouraged a lot of trust on the side of regular lay Catholics. And also what happened is that somehow Poles would cling even more to their faith, even though maybe they didn't have that much trust to the Church as an institution. And at the same time, churches would be only places apart from private houses where you could sing patriotic songs, because they would count as part of liturgy, for example. Yes, and then we have this very interesting philosophical idea of, or historiosophical idea of Poland being the Messiah of the nations, or the Christ of the nations. And it was actually heavily influenced by this heretic Jewish group, the Frankists. When Poland was, as a country, non-existent in the 19th century, what was promoted very much in Polish poetry, literature, drama, especially in the first half of the 19th century, was this idea that Poland is just like Christ. She died, now she's in a tomb, but she's waiting for her resurrection. And this suffering is not even important, it's necessary to bring freedom and justice to other nations. And many Poles would engage not only in Polish risings, but also in freedom for independence in the States, then in various colonies in many European countries. What is interesting is also during this period, many Poles, including many priests, were deported to Siberia. and this became a very important element of Polish memory of 19th century and Polish national identity. I would say that you, if you consider yourself a Pole, you have to be ready to suffer. And it's almost like in the gospel, if you want to follow me, leave everything you have. So Polishness is very demanding. It's very exclusive. Yes, especially under the Russians, in the Russian partition, Catholic Church was persecuted. Therefore, people would trust the Catholic Church on these lands more, because obviously they wouldn't trust the occupier, but this somehow strengthened the authority of the Catholic Church and the trust. Then Poland in 1918 got back its independence, so finally resurrected. And during that time, there were three main institutions: the army, because thanks to the army, we became again an independent country, the church and intelligentsia, so intellectual elites of the country. But the country wasn't very Catholic when it comes to the population. It was only 65% as compared to 86% today, and 97% 10 years or 20 years ago. But what is important to know that it's in this period, Polishness is very often juxtaposed to Jewishness. Therefore, the whole discourse of real Pole being Catholic re-emerges with strength. And many clergy members were very, very sympathetic to the nationalist ideology. And that was even more strengthened by the Soviet or communist threat. Then we went through the World War, and again, as always when Poland was somehow threatened politically, its existence was very unsure, or it simply ceased to exist, Poles flocked to the church. They felt that this is the only institution when they can cultivate their Polishness. So also after the war, again Norman Davies, I'm sorry, the church survived, and it survived in this halo of martyrdom, and somehow figures such as Maximilian Kolbe, they became symbols of sacred union between the nation and the church, that in the end become the same thing. I'm very visual, so I also noted that even though all these signs, all these colors and iconographical elements, like the habit or the crowns or the garment used in Auschwitz, they have their explanation, but at the same time I think there are a lot of allusions to Polishness. Like even two crowns, obviously, one is chastity and one is martyrdom, but they are red and white, just as Polish flag. So again, we have these categories that are overlapping, and especially in this period after World War II, during the communist period, again, Poles were unable to separate these two categories to a large extent. If you were a real patriot, if you were against the communist regime, you would be Catholic. You would go to the church, also because it's the only institution that is independent ideologically from the regime. Plus, we had these two wonderful figures, Pope John Paul II who's on this picture kissing the hand of Cardinal Wyszynski. And these two people were icons for Polish society. And this happened not only because they were spiritual leaders, but first of all because they had the strength, the power to face the communist regime and in the end to overcome it. Therefore, again, you have these overlapping categories of Polishness and being Catholic. Plus, during that period, also Poland became much more monolithic when it comes to ethnicity and religion. So, vast majority of Poles, over 90%, would actually be Catholic. Yes, we have 3 more minutes,
Oh,
so
you can go on.
this is more or less the panorama that I wanted to show you. But just to sum it up, I wanted to point out a few main traits of Polish national identity, which are, to me, somewhere in between of being Catholic and being ethnically or nationally Polish. So I don't know if that was clear in my talk, but for Poles, being Polish was more connected to certain values that are mostly spiritual or moral. Therefore, being Polish is not connected actually to the land or to your blood, but more to your way of behaving and accepting certain moral or spiritual values. It's a commitment. It requires sacrifices and readiness to protect other nations, to basically it's a calling in a way. At least I think many generations of Poles thought of this in this way. And what I mentioned, this parallel between Christianity and Polishness, that it requires, basically, it requires a person to follow the same demands that are in the gospel, to leave everything behind and sacrifice everything for the sake of the nation, but not because this nation is something material. It's a spiritual bond that unites people. So, in the end, Poland ends up being a certain idea, not really a country that we can place on a map. And this results to a large extent from the fact that for a long time Poland was not on a map. And today, even though I would say that all these elements are present in how Poles see themselves, during the last 20 years, things are changing. So we have now 87% Catholics in Poland. In comparison, over 20 years ago, we had 96%. So it's quite a change. And this is, I think, really, really interesting that we have 87% Catholics and 86% of those who believe in God. Yes, what I think is interesting when it comes to this notion of a nation is that, it's twice, 64% of Poles are convinced that being Catholic is quite or very important in order to be a true Polish citizen. So it's still quite a lot, I'd say. It's more than a half. And still over a half of Polish population thinks that our culture is better than our cultures. And why? Because it's more, it's something more in terms of these moral or spiritual values, not only in terms of food or culture per se. yes, I don't know, this might be interesting for you here, although I'm still not entirely sure how church, for example, Catholic Church, is financed in Sweden or other Scandinavian countries. But in Poland, where the church receives regular support from the state, only 28% of the society thinks that the church should be supported by the state, and only 27% prays every day. Therefore, there is a big gap between these, I would say, ideological attachment to Catholicism and a real practice of everyday life. I hope that was helpful or interesting in any way. Thank you very much for your attention.